Yes, please.
Button.
Go for it.
Okay. All right. We probably have time for one or two more introductions before we start. So anyone kind of like wanting to just quickly say hello? It's always nice to hear from you guys.
Sure. Alexander Musa. I'm a staff writer for the American River Current at American River College.
Nice. Northern California. Okay, well, let's get started. Unless anyone else wants to just very quickly say hello. Our lineup today, I mean, I'm thinking raise your hand, either with a little blue hand or just like physically, or even just say something if you have some experience in investigative journalism or social justice journalism, if you've done some at your campus student media, or maybe in a class. Okay, so I'm seeing about maybe a fourth or a fifth of you. Now, if you can put your hands down and raise your hand if it's something that you may be interested in pursuing as a career, investigative or social justice journalism. Okay, well, looks like about the same number, I would say, about a fifth. Okay, well, I'm really glad that you're here. This is, even if you're not sure if you're wanting to pursue it, it's something that honestly, you will probably end up doing some of if you're in a newsroom, okay? And that'll give you kind of a flavor of whether you like it and how much of it you want to do. It's definitely not easy. It can take, it can be kind of grueling, but it's probably the most worthwhile, one of the most worthwhile types of journalism that you could pursue. Sorry, I'm just trying to I'm trying to share my screen. I don't know why it's not working. Oh, there, okay. All right, so just to get started, I wanted to do some quick intros. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have a wonderful guest speaker named Kurtis Lee from the Los Angeles Times. He has left us an audio message talking about one of his favorite stories and why, and just with some general advice for you guys. So that'll be nice. We'll listen to that. But the reason he couldn't be here is because he's covering the election results. Okay, he's in Michigan covering that, and so you'll be able to check out some of his work. After we do our introductions, it's nice that I got to hear from a little bit about you guys, but I want to tell you a little bit about Kurtis and myself. We'll talk about what is investigative and social justice reporting, what's the relationship of that and something that you've probably heard of, objectivity, right? So, there can be a little bit of a conflict there sometimes. And then we're going to go through some examples and take questions. So because we're still going to hear from Kurtis, I did want to tell you a little bit about him. He's a national correspondent for the LA Times, which makes sense that he's covering the election, right? And that he's in Michigan today. Who knew that the timing of the results were going to be such that this was going to be such an important day for his beat. But anyway, he writes a range of stories, including social justice and political stories. He covers, immigration and income inequality, the Second Amendment. He covered the unrest and the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and he chronicled, Trump's rise to the presidency. Before the LA Times, he actually worked at the Denver Post, where he also covered politics, more like on a state and regional level. And he's also reported from the scenes of some breaking news like destructive wildfires, mass shootings, and he was part of the Washington Post staff that covered the 2013 that got the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news for the Aurora Theater shooting. So that's Kurtis. And as for me, I'm a professor at Cal State LA. I'm the head of the journalism program there. Before that, I was an investigative reporter. I actually taught briefly at Fullerton College for 2 years before I was at Cal State LA. And so I'm very familiar with community colleges and the quality and the importance of our California community colleges. But before that, I was an investigative reporter at different investigative nonprofits. For instance, the Center for Public Integrity, you may have heard of that. the Better Government Association, and I was also an investigative reporter for public radio. I don't know if anybody here is an NPR fan, but I worked for the NPR affiliate in Washington, D.C. called WAMU. But I really learned the ropes at newspapers because, you're like, it's like the daily grind, right? You're publishing every day. And so I really learned how to do great reporting and journalism and watchdog reporting at the San Jose Mercury News and the South Florida Sun Sentinel. I was born in India, raised in Chicago. And even though this is kind of like my bio, my bio is kind of reflects a little bit my resume, but who I really am is probably what has driven me into investigative and social justice journalism. And who I really am stems from my mom. My mom is a single mother. She raised me in Chicago, and I saw her kind of. Yes, I do know Marisa. I just noticed somebody mentioned Marisa. She's our former editor-in-chief at the Cal State LA University Times. She's a digital editor, and currently she's a station manager of our public radio station. So yeah, she's one of my, one of our wonderful students in the program. Probably one of our top students in the past few years. So anyhow, what I was going to tell you is that my story stems from my mom. I saw her work hard in a X-ray tube factory. They make light bulbs, basically, piecing together these small parts of a light bulb pretty much all day. And then, and it was just grueling work. She could barely make the rent, it's just like not a good situation. So one of her friends on the factory floor was like, "Child, you belong in the office. You can totally do it," basically. And so she suggested my mom take community college classes. So she took night class at our local community college in Chicago, Wilbur Wright. And so she would basically spend the whole day at the factory working her job. She did her community college class at night, like maybe some of you are doing, trying to juggle work and school. And then she'd come home, pick me up from the babysitters, we'd go home, and she would check my homework. Then she would do her own homework. And so I don't even know like what time she would get to bed. It was like 1:30 or 2 on most nights. And then she'd wake up and start the routine all over again. So for me, I kind of saw her as an important role model for me. And I also saw her struggle so many times that I just kind of, it's just like ingrained in you. The way you're raised often fuels what you do with your life, right? And so for me, it's like telling the stories of undercovered communities and telling stories of people like my mom who don't have time to find out about important public issues that actually affect their lives. That's a passion for me, right? And so that kind of fueled a lot of my career and a lot of my reporting is just seeing my mom struggle. And as I'm sure, many of you, may have similar stories, or maybe your parents have similar stories. That kind of what's fueled me in my career. But it doesn't happen overnight, okay? So we'll get into that in a minute. So that's a little bit about me. Before we get started on looking at some examples and dissecting them, what is, in your opinion, what is investigative reporting? Does anyone want to share what they consider, what makes a story investigative in nature?
Going beyond the surface level of the story, beyond the obvious.
Going beyond the obvious, beyond the surface level, beyond the he said, she said of daily news reporting, right?
Right.
What else?
Right.
What else do you think? Anyone else want to chime in? And what else you consider investigative versus a regular news story or feature? Jesse?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was on mute. You're exposing something like corruption or discovering something, unearthing something that people didn't know.
Absolutely. Okay. You're exposing, revealing, unearthing, uncovering. It's new information that you have dug up and found. Okay. And it requires a lot of digging, as my son is doing in this photo. I mean, sometimes it's like you're interviewing dozens or hundreds of people. For some of my projects, I have read through thousands of pages of documents, public records, right? I have, analyzed, cleaned, and visualized 100,000 rows of data. Okay, so you get the idea, right? And then kind of a branch of investigative, I would consider is social justice reporting. What does that mean? What are some examples of historically of social justice reporting? Not right now, we'll talk about right now in a minute, but historically, this is not a new thing. Social justice reporting has been around for a very long time, as long as these issues of disenfranchisement have been around, right? And so what do you think, what are some historical examples of social justice reporting? The kind of
Rodney
issues
King.
that were covered. I'm sorry, what?
Rodney King, everything surrounding that.
Okay, yes, yeah. I mean, there were issues with police violence, right? That's been dating back to even before Rodney King, but certainly
Right.
that's a good historical example right here from LA. Okay, what else? Any other examples?
Covering women's right to vote in the 20s.
Yes, suffrage, right? Women's right to vote. Excellent. What else?
I was gonna say the children being held in cages at the border.
That's a more current issue, but absolutely. Okay, that is a social justice issue, the issues related to ICE and immigration and certainly the children separated from their families and all of that, okay, in the inhumane conditions. Anything else?
Civil rights protests throughout the 60s and 70s, including Vietnam.
Absolutely, okay? Civil rights is huge. The Vietnam protests, huge. Okay, so you guys get the idea. You know, historically, you've probably heard of a book called The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, about conditions in the Chicago meat packing factories and kind of some of the laborers there who's like literally like the working conditions were so bad their limbs would get cut off. Nellie Bly's stories about child labor, Jacob Reese's articles about how the other half lives, which got turned into a book. Does anybody know Ida B. Wells? She's another one, an important figure who's pictured here. Can you tell me who Ida B. Wells is? Anyone who's heard of her?
She was an investigative journalist who did a big story on lynching in the United States. I think it was the early 20th century.
Exactly. So she did a number of stories, you know, human rights, civil rights issues. But one of her biggest investigations was basically uncovering that the main reason Southerners were using to justify the lynchings, rape, was a fallacy. It was wrong. Most of those relationships were consensual, and she did it by gathering data, by interviewing individual families, hundreds of people, right? By doing her own little and mini investigations on each of these cases, gathering that data, analyzing that data, summarizing it. And so she used, you know, many of the methods that you'll learn about or that you may have heard about to gather her reporting and to basically collect proof so that her story would be bulletproof, okay? Okay, some recent examples, somebody mentioned immigration and DACA and all that. What else? Border issues, what else is a recent example? There's lots to cover these days.
Right.
Police
George Floyd.
murders.
I'm sorry, Sean, what did you say?
I was gonna say police murders, George Floyd specifically, like Alexander said, but yeah.
Police brutality, police shootings, good, okay, all right. What else?
LGBTQ issues, trans rights.
Absolutely, absolutely, LGBT issues from employment to marriage equality, absolutely. What else?
Access to healthcare and unemployment during the pandemic.
Absolutely, okay, the issues that a lot of our essential workers are dealing with, right? Any others that you guys wanna, well, here, I just revealed it, so it's fine. The Me Too movement would fall into this, criminal justice issues more broadly, you know, beyond just police brutality, but, you know, issues with courts and in prison rights and that kind of thing. Elderly youth rights and even housing issues like gentrification. Social media has really elevated the role and the opportunities. Why?
Report it as it happens, and you can reach a larger audience.
It's one of the issues. Social justice is one of those issues that can really that can really circulate and distribute well online, right? And on social media specifically. These kind of stories are like wildfire, okay? When somebody's able to get a recording and post it on social media, and it's a video showing something happening that is considered, that's just not right, that's wrong. That's going to have it's going to go viral basically, right, on social media. So if you're writing about one of these stories, you have a great chance of extreme exposure. I mean, there's going to be things that are happening on your community college campuses sometimes, right? It's weird during the pandemic, that's not going to happen so much, but I'm sure, when things are back to normal, or if you were to do a FOIA request of student complaints or something, there might be stories there, okay, that even happen within your own communities. Okay, now whether or not somebody has video footage is another story, right? But if you do, then it's almost like, that really helps that story provide backing and providing proof. And that's kind of what NPR's Eric Deggans basically said in his book, Race Baiter, is we're not gonna go through this quote because we're running a little short on time, but that book is definitely worth looking into. So this is kind of what I was getting at in the beginning, is that, when you first join a newsroom, you're probably, as a early career journalist, you're probably not gonna have an opportunity to be an investigative or social justice reporter right off the bat, okay? Typically it doesn't work that way. And that's what I found, right? When I was in newsrooms, I was like, oh, okay. Like I have a specialty, one of my majors was gender studies. I taught in a high school, inner city high school. I covered race and demographics as my first beat. But I'm not going to be able to get that social justice reporting or that investigative reporting job right off the bat. However, what I learned is that most beats, the kind of beats that we get assigned as young reporters or as early career reporters, lend themselves really well to these kinds of stories. Because I realized that the kind of things that we cover, when we first enter a newsroom, or even in student media, education, local government, utilities, federal politics, all my various beats, that those beats actually very deeply affect children, the elderly, low-income folks, people of color, and the kind of issues I'm thinking of are like transportation, like what is the bus fare, right? Like, is the city going to increase the bus fare? Taxes, public library hours, what schools are going to stay open and which aren't, right? Neighborhood safety. These are all issues that deeply affect the public. And so there's lots of opportunities to be able to find those kinds of stories. Okay, the one thing I will say is, this is actually a little bit out of order, so let me just stop the share for a second. Does anybody have questions before I keep going? No? No questions at this point? Okay. Before we get into objectivity, I want to give you a quick example of some stories that you can do during your internships or during your first jobs that actually allow you to get at this. I mean, of course you can pitch the story, pitch some investigative stories, but there are stories that lend themselves really well to this kind of reporting, okay? And some beats that do. So when I was covering youth issues, I was able to cover racist remarks made by teachers at a Fremont school district. And one complaint about this, one instance, led me to do a FOIA request and to find out about 3 other incidences, okay? This was in the San Francisco Bay Area. So here's the thing, like you get one example, but then you find out it's a little bit more pervasive, where teachers and administrators were saying these remarks, okay? So I did a whole story on that. I found that there were subtle forms of racism and classism in, I don't know if you guys know of the town called Los Altos in the Bay Area, but it's kind of a posh area, and they decided to ban nail salons. And nail salons, in that town, most of them were owned by Vietnamese Americans. And so that community basically thought that it was kind of a racist policy, because they were trying to only allow the really posh and fancy, and they made an exception for a European style nail salon, whereas they banned all the others. I wrote about boys struggling with eating disorders, textbooks with misinformation about Hinduism and Islam, Eastern religions, textbooks that were literally making things up about these religions, okay, that were just not factual. And, you know, and if you see that, you know, I'm no expert, right? Even though that may be my religion, but, you know, you get a religious studies professor or somebody and they verify that, wait a minute, no, there's no mention of elves in forests in Hinduism. See what I'm saying? So on the education beat, I noticed that, have you guys heard of East Palo Alto in the Bay Area? Anyone?
Mm-hmm.
Well, at that time, when I covered school districts, East Palo Alto, the Ravenswood School District in East Palo Alto was basically like the poorest school district that I covered, okay? And I was trying to figure out, like, how does the revenue that school districts get affect students? So one of my observations was they were having, in one of the classes I visited, they were having students hand write out entire chapters of a textbook because they didn't have enough textbooks for the kids to take home. So they were spending class time writing out the entire chapter so that they could then go home and answer questions about that chapter. And that was just one example of, you know, there were other, you know, lots of other things that they didn't have. And so I looked at the budget and I found out that one of my findings from the budget was that they spent more on bottled water for faculty and administrative lounges than 4 other bigger school districts combined. Okay, so that's how, if you can see the top bar chart. And so these are all stories that I did on my beats, and yet I wasn't necessarily an investigative reporter, right? So this is what I'm telling you is, like, look for those opportunities to tell stories like that. The next thing I wanted to talk about is objectivity. What does objectivity mean? For those of you who...
Impartiality.
Saying both sides of the story.
Okay, impartiality, being balanced, right? Providing both sides, which is definitely important. And basically being impartial, leaving your biases aside, okay? And being able to kind of report the story without kind of bringing your own feelings into it, right? And that's how we do most of our stories, you know? The one thing I will say about investigative reporting is there is actually a step in the process where subjectivity or your own background or your own feelings about what is right or wrong do come into play. And so this is where, you know, this is where investigative and social justice reporting can be a little bit different than just, say, you know, covering like a breaking news story. Because we're going to be spending so much time on these stories, you know, if I'm going to be spending 9 months on my investigation, and I have in some cases, then it's got to be something that that I care about, right? I mean, we use our own moral judgment to pursue the stories that we pursue, right? And so, you know, that's, you know, our own backgrounds fuel that, right? They go into that. And so that's kind of where objectivity, you know, can be different. And I want to give you a quick example of a reporter who ran up against this issue of objectivity when trying to do her work in investigative journalism. My professor from Stanford, his name is Ted Glasser. He co-wrote a book called Custodians of Conscience. And in it, he talks about a reporter named Loretta Tofani, who won a Pulitzer for her work in the Post about prison rape. However, when she pitched that story, her editor said, no, can't do that story. Why? She wanted to write about prison rape. What do you think the issue was?
Maybe the subject itself, it's kind of a rough story to report. If you do it wrong, you could potentially burn sources. You could get people hurt, cost people jobs, and it could also affect the reputation of the paper itself if they do it wrong. Not to mention, it's like someone in chat just now, Jacob Frank, says people might not want to read it. I mean, it's an incredibly brutal topic to even discuss.
Okay, and all of those things probably factored in, but the reasoning, the rationale was, like, what's new about prison rape? Obviously, like, yeah, it happens. It's like, everybody knows that happens, right? Everybody knows that happens, and, you know, they're in prison. So like, oh, kind of like, well, you know, it's kind of an inevitable consequence, right? And the way she describes it is, the way Ted Glasser and James Edema, the other author, describe it is, it evoked a strong gut reaction in her. And her work was a conscious choice to show the wrong in a situation that is often seen as inevitable and therefore acceptable. So basically, even though everyone else thought that was okay, or that it was like normal, or it was like it just happens and everybody knows that, she didn't. She felt that it needs to be covered, right? But what techniques do you think she used to transform her readers' perceptions about it, to make them not have the reaction her editor initially had? What can you do if you're covering a story like this?
Interviews.
I'm sorry, what, Star?
Interviews.
Interviews, okay? When you get in interviews and bringing the voices of real people into this to show why it matters, right? To show the, and the consequences of prison rape. And in some cases, she found that these men ended up having, severe trauma because of this. Some of them were institutionalized. Some of them were having nightmares. Some of them were they were a shell of who they were before, okay? They couldn't even testify at their trials, right? And some of these people might have been people with questionable convictions in the first place, but even if they weren't, they're human beings. And she recognized that, and she decided that, even though they're in prison, and even though, it may not be a surprise, I'm gonna tell their stories, because those stories can evoke a reaction in people, in readers. And, it can kind of evoke that moral outrage, okay? I'm going to give you a quick example of one of my investigative stories and social justice stories as well. And I'd like you to think about what is revealed here. What makes it investigative based on what we discussed? Actually, you know what? We don't have very much time. We only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to actually skip over to, instead of listening to this piece, we're going to skip over to Kurtis's piece. Okay, that'll be a better example. That way we're able to hear what he has to say. And the one thing I will say before we go into Kurtis Lee's piece is think about what we just talked about with Loretta Tofani. She realized that she would really have to develop the character. She'd have to show, don't tell, right? She'd have to show, and here's a great quote from Anton Chekhov about showing, not telling. Can somebody read this to me? To all of us?
Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. Because moral
Go ahead,
because moral judgments are often required to pursue social justice reporting. Showing, not telling, the story is critical. What does that mean?
What does that mean, guys? In this case, well, we kind of talked about this already, so you don't have to answer that question. But I would like you to look for this kind of showing, not telling, in Kurtis's piece as you read it, okay? So let's go to Kurtis's piece, giving real examples and anecdotes and stats, okay, to basically prove your point. Show, don't tell. Have you guys heard of this before in your classes? Show, don't tell?
Yeah.
All the time.
And it's even more important in investigative reporting, Okay, yeah, facts and figures don't cut it. We're gonna skip my example. Let's go to Kurtis's. First, let's listen to him talk about it. And what I'd like you to do is to Google this headline and then just read maybe the first few paragraphs of it after we hear from Kurtis. Actually, why don't you do that now? Take a minute to read his lead and his nut graph, if you're able to do that. Are you able to do that, or is it too complicated with the Zoom screen up? I guess I can pull it up. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. Yeah, here we are. So I can pull it up, it's fine. Armed and Black, how a group of men licensed to carry guns say they're seeking racial justice. Actually, should we read this out loud together? Does somebody want to read the lead?
I got hit with a paywall, so unfortunately.
I think I found the story on the Chicago Tribune.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, you guys aren't seeing this. Okay, I'm sorry. I was trying to share my screen of it, but I think I needed to just change the screen. I have it on my screen now. Do you guys see it?
Yeah, I see that now.
You see it in the Zoom? Okay. Somebody want to read the lead?
I can go ahead and give it a shot.
And look for, as you're reading, everyone else, please look for examples of showing, not telling it, or character development.
Okay. Before he drove to the grocery store parking lot, Romeo Taylor did the same thing he's done every day this summer. He holstered his 9mm handgun to the waistband of his gym shorts until he could feel it hug his right hip. Just keep going. Okay. When he arrived at the store in North Minneapolis, he spotted 6 other black men, some in tactical gear, armed with Glock 23s and Smith & Wesson M&Ps. One of them beamed when he spotted Taylor and hugged him. "Bro, good to see you," Taylor said, muffled through a face mask. They had come together for a meet and greet to introduce themselves to the community, marking one of the first public gatherings of the Minnesota Freedom Fighters.
Okay, we're not going to get into the nut, and you guys will notice that sometimes with longer stories, like bigger projects like this, the leads are long. That's why, in case you're wondering, like, why was that like a 3 or 4 paragraph lead? That's normal. So were there any examples of real voices, character development, and or anecdotes in here? And just the lead? I mean, this is a very long story, and I would encourage you to keep reading it afterwards, but yeah?
Yeah.
Like what?
There was the beginning where I was talking about him holstering the 9mm handgun into his gym shorts till he could feel it hug his right hip. Like, they specifically call out, the fact that he's wearing gym shorts, the fact that it's like a specific feeling on his hip when the gun is there in his waistband. And there was another detail further down where he was talking muffled through a face mask, which kind of gives, it's interesting because it's Minneapolis, so he could be wearing a face mask because it's super cold, or he could be wearing it for another reason.
Okay, right, and it is right. That's a good point. But it gives you a slice of this time. What does this lead do? What is the point of the lead? Why do you think he decided to choose this anecdote as his lead?
It gives us like someone's perspective to see from, so it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the story, and it gives us a real life example too. It puts us in there with him to see there's more humanity brought into it that way.
Exactly. Okay, it takes us into this person's world, right? It's going to now tell the story from, this is one of the characters that it's going to tell the story through, okay? These public issues, as important as they are, we need somebody to connect with. And so this is somebody that we can connect with. We can feel the moment that they're in. We can almost, it's almost like we're there with this person, right? And so this is like, yeah, so this is a very effective way to, and you will find bigger projects like this, anecdotal leads do work well. I'm gonna keep going. I want you guys to hear what Kurtis has to say about it. Because he couldn't be here at the last minute, he actually left a little audio for you guys, okay, for you to listen to, and you can follow up with him on email if you have questions. So let's listen to that real quick.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kurtis Lee. I'm a national correspondent.
Can you guys hear that? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, before I...
Hi, everyone. My name is Kurtis Lee. I'm a national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. I hope you're all well today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm actually in Michigan right now doing some election coverage. But I wanted just to share a quick story with you. I do a lot of reporting at the Los Angeles Times on issues surrounding race, immigration, income inequality. One story that I recently did this year, actually a couple of months ago in September, was a story on a group called the Minnesota Freedom Fighters. This group of men, it's a group of Black men that came together in the days after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. I traveled to Minneapolis to report this story, and I visited with these men who came together to basically protect their communities from protests, from riots, from white supremacists who were coming into the communities after George Floyd's death and looking to do harm to Black communities. And I spent some time with them and talked about, some of the work that they do. These men are big supporters of the Second Amendment. They do carry firearms, but they're there to really protect the community in Minnesota and in Minneapolis in particular. And I spent a little time with them just talking about some of the issues that came about in those days in Minneapolis after George Floyd's death. And again, these were protests. I'm sure some of you saw these protests. They were in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, all over the country, and even all over the world. And, I really wanted to spend time with this group of men that formed this group there in Minneapolis to protect the community in the days after George Floyd's death. And this group is very much about building bonds between the local police department and also the Black community there in Minneapolis. And I would encourage you all, if you have a chance, please give it a read. Again, this is a story that ran in September in the Los Angeles Times, and it was a story on the Minnesota freedom fighters. Please give it a read, and please, send me an email with any questions. My email is Kurtis, Kurtis .lee@latimes.com. Yes, please give it a read, and please reach out if you have questions. And again, I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you guys today in person, but I look to spend some time with you in the near future. Take care. Bye.
Okay, so we have the story. I didn't realize I put that in there. We're going to take questions now. Before I take a few questions, I just wanted to say thanks to JACC and Professor Deck for organizing a lot of the programming. Also, any of the JACC students were involved. Here is the contact information for Kurtis and for me. I'm going to stop the share now so we can just take a few questions. I think we have like a couple minutes for questions. So, and you can always.
I have a question, Julie.
Sure.
And I thought about this when you first shared your story about your mom. And I was wondering how do you balance your efforts in uncovering social injustice and kind of the greater magnitude of how much of it there is? Like,
it's
where
not,
do you
it's,
see?
it's a tough balance, honestly, because you can get upset, as a journalist, I'm very passionate, I'm sure many of you are, and there's so many problems in the world, right? And so, honestly, like I never really learned how to strike a balance as an investigative reporter, because I just felt there were so many important issues to cover, and that's actually one of the reasons I transitioned to academia, because I just couldn't handle it. I was like, I just got so obsessed and wrapped up in my stories, and I still do that. I'm still working on an investigative project with my students. We got funded, with a grant for it, but I just found that it was just so all-consuming for me that I never struck a balance. You have to be able to find a balance, though. That's my biggest advice to you. Like, you have to be able to just like walk away from it and let go. And for me, it was really hard because like the kind of sources I had, they were truly struggling, and so for me to like not take their call, if somebody called me, at like 7 or 8 or even 9 or 10, I'd be like, I kind of would feel bad, but you can't be that way. You need to have a balance. It's not fair for, if you eventually have a family like I do, I have 2 kids, it's just not going to work very well. So I never struck the balance, but you guys, I hope that you guys find ways to do that. That's really important. But yeah, it's never ending, the number of stories you could pursue. And people start hitting you up. Once they know the kind of journalism you do, they start sending you tips. And so I think part of that is just like trying to dole some of those tips out to other people in the newsroom.
I have a question as well. You were talking about how objectivity is a big part of investigative reporting, and you showed us your bar chart from the water textbook story, and you also talked about the Vietnamese nail salons being shut down in Los Altos, right? So would you say knowing how to work with data is a big part of investigative journalism, something that would really kind of helps cement that objectivity?
Absolutely, Dominic. I mean, there is no better proof that you're going to find. The anecdotes are important. The voices of real people are important, like we talked about, but nobody can argue with data, right? So I think that's data journalism has been one of the most important things in my own work, because it allowed me to like back up what I was saying, back up those trends. When there are issues that people are questioning you on, like, why are you covering this? When you have data to back it up, data about redlining or whatever you're looking at about housing insecurity. In DC, when I covered developers, I was investigating developers, and the line that they kept telling me, the council members and the developers, is, oh, we're doing this to revive poor communities. That's why we're taking taxpayer money and giving it to the developers, because we want to revive low-income communities. And so, but my partner and I, Patrick Madden, we were able to prove them wrong with data. We're like, less than 5% of the $19 billion you guys have given away have gone to the two poorest wards in DC, wards 7 and 8, where a fourth of the people live. And so nobody can argue with that once you get the data. So that's a great point. I would, if you guys are interested in data, if you try it, anyone can learn it. You don't have to be into math or anything. If you do a little bit of data analysis, it's really going to help. It's helped me time and time again, not just on the really big projects, but even on the smaller stories. It'll set you apart. Good question.
Kind of bouncing off of the previous question before that one, I find myself, for some investigative pieces that I'm getting too emotionally, I guess, involved, because I care so much about it. How do you kind of make that distinction between your own emotions and covering something so like horrific as racism or social justice issues?
So that's a really great question. I think it's really difficult if you're personally affected, your community is personally affected by so many of these social justice issues. It's almost like, how do you separate yourself, right? You're supposed to be this objective, balanced reporter, and yet it's so personal to you. You feel it's so raw and it's so deep. And I think the best way to do it is to use the energy and the passion that comes from that to then fuel it into your story by telling other people's stories. It's not about you, right? It's about the communities we cover, and especially like the undercovered communities. And so use their voices to help propel you to tell the best story you can, to try to do justice to their stories. And then that'll allow you to leave your opinions out. I mean, like I said, I challenge objectivity only in the part where I'm talking about, choosing your story idea, because, what you decide to choose to go after, that's where you can bring your own passion and your thoughts into it, right? And then take that energy and that passion and divert it into trying to do justice to the people that you're covering. But yeah, it can be tough when you get, so emotionally involved. And I mean, I've kept in touch with some of my sources for the deeper stories. I mean, I just literally like a week or two ago, I checked in with somebody who was part of a project, Tainted Trial Stolen Justice story in San Jose, that led to sentences being overturned and stuff like that. So I checked in with them 2 weeks ago. So it's like you keep in touch with people because you get to know them sometimes.
I have a question. So about the objectivity topic again, I know in a lot of journalism classes, we're instructed to kind of give both sides or both viewpoints and kind of give a voice to the other party. And in social justice stories, I don't know, like, are you still obligated to give them that voice? And like, can you do it to a lesser extent, or?
I mean, here's the thing, like, you don't want to, yes, the short answer is yes. You have to give a voice to the other side. Otherwise you could be in legal trouble. You see what I'm saying? Like, you have to give that person the voice. However, there is something called false equivalency. This is a little more complicated, but where, you get this feeling like, oh, you need to give equal, voice to each person. And that's where investigative journalism is really helpful, because if there are things that people are saying that are not true, I feel morally obligated to not include it. Yes, they have to have their voice, but I also fact check what they tell me, both sides, not just, not just one side or the other, not just the side that, I might personally relate to. I fact check that stuff. And that's where, if you can go beyond he said or she said, and you can actually get to the truth of some of these issues, then you're not going to have that issue. You still have to include context from the other side. Don't get me wrong. You have to protect yourself. Okay. If you don't want to be liable, you want to be fair. And also, like, who knows, sometimes people have something to say that might actually change your mind on an issue, right? Or that might explain why something happened, why something went down the way that it did. So I don't know if that helps, but I would say, yes, you're obligated to get the other side. You want to protect yourself legally, especially if you're student media. You know, your university or your college are not liable. The student media editors are. So, but at the same time, you want to fact check what they're saying and not just run like whatever the other side is saying, like, you know, wholesale. Like, no, fact check it. Anyone else?
Yes, I have a question. Now, I'd like to think that when we're doing these types of pieces, that we're trying to spark some kind of change. And one of the tools that a lot of people use to spread information and try to spark change is social media. We just had the keynote speaker, Steve Padilla, I believe was his name, tell us to, well, from what I was hearing, don't post anything. Okay. How do you manage something like that when you're writing about these kinds of things that we're so passionate about and that we're wanting, you know, to share and get out to the world? And, you know, so many people use social media for things like that. So what do you recommend?
Let other people's voices tell the story. It's really not about you, you know? Maybe at some point you'll decide to go into opinion writing and doing commentaries. Maybe at some point you'll do a personal essay, and then it's fine to bring your voice into it. But if we let the people who we're covering amplify their voices, not our own voices, then that could drive your story. I mean, you might have an amazing quote from somebody who was affected by an issue, or somebody who, you know, whose family was a victim of police targeting or something. You include their quote, that's them saying it, not you. See what I'm saying? And you can share that on social media. You know, you could even do some audio of that person. Do like a little audiogram or something. I mean, I think Steve Padilla is right when he says that be careful on social media. People will, your prospective employers will Google you. That's like one of the first things that they're gonna do, right? And so they don't want you to come off as somebody who's being like all opinionated on social media. But that doesn't mean that you don't pursue the kind of stories that you care about. See what I'm saying? That's where you have a voice.
But and on the same side of that though, how do you handle, like, let's say you uncover certain types of stories and people accuse you of bias because you're, you know, unearthing, you know, environmental issues, and they say, oh well, you're biased towards environmental issues. Like, how would you?
There will be a lot of bullying. You know, I've been bullied by like, there are companies that I cover with like huge PR divisions, and they'll just like nitpick at my work. But you have to have that's why you have to get all the facts right. You got to be accurate. That's like the number one thing. And your editor has to have your back through the reporting process. All you can do is reveal what you have to reveal, provide context from the other person, and that's it. And they will criticize you. You know, I know there are people who tried to get me fired for negative coverage. I'm just like revealing stuff, and that's okay. You have to be okay with it as long as you're doing the right thing, and as long as it's for the public. And those readers and those the audience members and the people on social media, they will back you if you're doing the right thing. If you're really uncovering something that's really wrong, that is backed up with facts and stats and lots of anecdotes, you know, then you're doing the right thing, and people will be grateful and appreciative. So while you're getting criticized, you'll also get some of the, you know, you'll get people telling you that they're thankful. So it kind of helps keep you doing it. So anyway, I think you guys have to go to your next sessions now. Thank you so much for participating and for being here. It's been great meeting all of you. I hope if you give me a follow on social media, I'll follow you back. That way I can kind of keep track of your work. I love seeing what you guys end up doing at your, you know, taking some of this information from JACC and applying it to your student media work. I know this is a tough time. Hang in there. I know it's a lot harder to get a hold of sources and stuff. But you guys, you know, when I see the work that comes across and some of the awards that you guys win, I'm just like really impressed and proud of the kind of work that you guys are doing. So just keep up the great work. Let me know if you ever have questions. If you have questions about data or FOIA or anything like that, you have my email now, okay? Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Kylie.
for being here.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
What was your social media handle?
It's Julie Patel on Twitter.
That's really lit.
And
Yeah.
it's Julie V Patel on Instagram.
I just followed you on Twitter.
Okay, thanks Daniela, I'll follow you back.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, the Instagram?
Instagram is Julie V Patel, like Victor.
Okay.
V.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I'll read the chat. Oh, darn, I wish I'd read it earlier. Okay. Okay, somebody had a question about recordings. Yes, we'll send the recordings out.